Welcome to another episode of a Nest podcast with me, Rida Alwan.
and me, Naba Madani. And today we're joined by Khyam Allami, a musician, researcher, and a composer. Welcome, Khyam.
Yeah, hello.
Thank you for joining us today.
You're very welcome. Thank you for having me.
Gosh,
Thank you for flying in as well.
Yeah.
You've just flown in from Lebanon.
Perfect timing, yeah.
Thank you so much for
Thank
joining
you.
us.
Yes, absolutely. Gosh, we've got so much to talk about today.
Inshallah.
Where do we start, Rida?
I normally like to start from the beginning. So, obviously, Iraqi, where were you born? How did it start? Both parents Iraqi. Let's just have a little understanding of who you are and where you started your life.
Yeah, both my parents are from Baghdad.
Okay.
I was born in Damascus and moved to London when I was 9
Okay.
and raised here then for the majority of that. And then left in around 2011, 2012.
School, college, university,
Everything here, yeah.
and then you've done your PhD.
And then I did my PhD. I finished a couple of years ago, yeah.
Wow.
What was your PhD in?
Composition, experimental composition.
Wow.
Mm.
That must have been quite a journey.
The PhD journey, it was
Yeah.
pretty intense, I have to say, because it started with one kind of intention, and then just as with most PhDs, things tend to change over time. So it ended up being quite unwieldy, let's say.
Okay, so you
Yeah.
went in with an idea. What was the idea?
The idea was to think about experimentalism in Arabic music. How can one create Arabic music that is experimental, but at the same time is culturally situated, based on the fundamentals of the culture that you're dealing with, but without forgetting one's own individual directionality and history. I mean, it's for somebody like me who has had this kind of double life in between the Arab culture and then being here in the UK, growing up here in the UK, it would have been disingenuous of me to pretend that the part of me that grew up in the UK and had access to a lot of the music and culture that I grew up with didn't somehow have an impact or an influence. So the idea was, how can I maintain that individuality, but at the same time be genuine and like connected to the culture that I'm interested in researching about and working in, this kind of thing. And that started off as the main guiding line, and it stayed, but the way that transformed throughout the few years of doing the research was something I wasn't expecting. So especially then taking this turn looking into technology, what technology means for music making, how it impacts our imaginary, how it impacts our subconscious, how we use tools to make music today.
Wow.
Wow.
Mm.
Amazing.
That must have been a complete eye-opening experience. I want to take you back a couple of steps. Obviously, you started when you came here when you were 9 years old. Fitting in when you first came to the UK, how did that feel?
Oh,
Taking you back a few years.
I have to say, I think in the early days it was kind of easy because there's an excitement when you're at that age. I think there's an excitement of just having access to things that are different and new. I mean, I remember, I don't know, just simple things like having access to video games or meeting lots of different kinds of people at school. It was kind of exciting. As time went on, it became more difficult. So the early days were kind of okay, I think. But by the time I got into the kind of teenage years, 14, 15, up until about, I think, 18, 19, it was pretty difficult.
Okay.
What
Yeah.
was the difficulty that you faced?
You start to feel a little bit more alienated. You start to feel different. You start to feel like you have to take sides in some shape or form. I mean, I went through a phase of probably, I would say, a good 7 or 8 years of not speaking Arabic, not really engaging in the culture in any way, trying to find something else. So I got really into punk rock and metal and the kind of subculture, you know, offbeat, way of thinking about things, kind of lefty, I guess. That became a big part of this kind of rebellious period in my life. And thinking back to it now, I realize it's because that there was this real imbalance of, you know, who you are and what you're doing and what language you speak and what kind of culture you engage with and what's at home and what's at home, which is actually a small part of your day-to-day, and what's outside, which is the majority of your day-to-day and the people you're engaging with and whatever culture you're interacting with, this kind of thing.
Do you mind if I ask, do you know what might have triggered that? Was there something that happened? Was there like a war on? Was Iraq? Was there a problem? Or is it just because I think I went through a phase of like, you know, I didn't want to speak Arabic. It was, I didn't identify as Iraqi, you know, because it was just sort of, I was lost. You know, we're here in the UK, you're trying to fit in, and it's just like, you go through all of these different phases, and then you sit down later on in life and you're like, why? And you sit down, you start reflecting, like, do you know what triggered it or what might have caused it?
It's difficult to say. I think it's always, for each one of us, it's very different and very
of course,
complex.
Yeah.
For me, I think one of the main things is that my extended family remained in Iraq, so I didn't have access to them apart from simple phone calls. And with the Gulf War in the early 90s and then the sanctions, we just got used to having these very simple phone conversations. You know, hi uncle, hi auntie, are you okay? Is everybody all right? That would be the end of it.
Yeah, Eid Mubarak, and that would be it.
That's it. Yeah. And then over time, that just kind of phases out, and you just end up not even having that phone call. You're just relying on your parents to let you know whether everybody's okay or not. So not having access to families, extended family, was a major thing. We didn't get our citizenship and passport until 10 years after we got here. So when I was 19, I got my British passport, which meant I wasn't even able to travel in those 10 years anywhere with my family. So that is another thing, you know, you're unable to go and visit, I don't know, Amman, Beirut, anywhere else.
I can relate to that because we couldn't even go to Denmark to go see my cousins or anything. Yeah, absolutely.
So you have no way of connecting with family, and you have no way of connecting with the culture. So you end up relying on living everything vicariously through your community. And I was very lucky that we arrived at a point in time when there was a kind of migration, or, you know, it was a migration of Iraqis to London in the early 90s, all of whom were, you know, came to the UK as refugees and were going through a very similar process. So I grew up with children of my parents' friends that were going through the same process as me, but had very, very different circumstances. Maybe they had family in Dubai or in Amman or somewhere else in Europe. Many of them got their citizenships before us, so they were able to connect on a deeper level than I was able to. That's one part of it. The other part of it, which came through, you know, over the last years of therapy and trying to unpack all of this stuff, was actually the amount of racism that I went through as a young boy here in the UK. I think a lot of the time when something is so hurtful, you just tend to minimize it. But the reaction to it ends up being very, very subconscious. So a big part, I think, of this rejection was not wanting to be, rejection of the identity and rejection of the culture was not wanting to be hurt by others, because that was such a major thing. I mean, I remember when we first arrived, I had to take my mother's maiden name because we arrived before my father. So paperwork-wise, I was Khyam Hussein. And being Khyam Hussein during the Gulf War at school was just a nightmare, you know. Endless jabs and remarks about, you're from Saddam Hussein's family, you're a terrorist, you're whatever, all of this stuff. So it just makes you push back when you're that young. You don't want to have those kind of confrontations, and you don't even know how to deal with it. I don't think any of us as like migrant refugee children had any kind of preparation or ways of dealing with, or mentorship for how to deal with those kind of situations. You're just left alone in the playground, right?
Literally, we were the first generation that arrived, and we had to learn how to deal with it so that we can teach the people after us.
Yeah,
that's so true.
And it's just we were I say it very with a heavy heart, we were the test dummies. You know, for most of the situations of how we first got into university, how we were the first to get to, you know, communicate, you know, go into the workspace and how to communicate, and then, you know, work with people that were backstabbing. And it's just like going to these work environments that just completely threw you off. Like, okay, there's no one here to coach me. I don't have a coach. I don't have a mentor. And I was like, oh my God.
Yeah.
And I think we did struggle quite a lot. I think the second generation and third generation after us, they just don't know how good they've had it since we've sort of, we've gone through so many different types of racism, struggles. Yeah, I can truly relate to that.
I think the other thing is that the issue with the UK in general is the sense of segregation. I mean, I grew up in West London mostly, so starting close to the airport and slowly moving, you know, inwards towards centre. But so growing up with the kind of Indian Pakistani community in the early days was great. You know, we would spend our weekends in Southall. There's a sense of affinity that you have with other brown people that are around you, and then spending time with the Iraqi community that was, you know, wherever, Edgware Road and kind of northwest London. But over time, you end up more and more segregated, and it becomes more and more difficult. I think today's generation have a different kind of experience in engaging with the different communities that are here in the UK. There's a different kind of language today for engaging with racism, patriarchy, white supremacy, all this kind of stuff. It's much easier to find ways to express oneself, and it's much easier to defend oneself in certain situations. Whereas we didn't really have that. And because we didn't have connections to other migrant, like deeper connections to other migrant communities that have been here from the 70s, 80s, whether it be I don't know, like the West Indian or the Jamaican communities or the Bengali communities, there's no way to develop a means or a language to actually navigate those complexities. And so you're just kind of left to your own devices. And
yeah, absolutely. And our parents not speaking the language, I think that was a big impact as well, because we had to be the parents, right? We had to read their letters, we had to go with them to interpret, and all of those things, they just add up.
Absolutely. I remember, you know, literally plane landing, arriving at the airport from Damascus, and me having to be, at 9 years old, me having to help my mother with the kind of refugee process at the airport.
Wow.
In English, because I was studying English in Damascus. So I mean, I knew, in my mind, I only knew the basics: cat, milk, dog, biscuit, blah, blah. But my mother tells me that actually, no, you were pretty, you know, you were capable of maintaining a conversation and translating certain things and helping us get through those first early stages. So I have no recollection of that, but to think about that as a responsibility
from a very young age,
at that age, at the airport, when you're dealing with this kind of authority, I have no idea what kind of impact that might have had, you know.
So was music your escape?
100%. Always. Yeah.
So how did you get into music?
So can I just jump in?
Yeah.
Because you said punk and rock, because that was the earlier side of music, or
no?
Okay,
it started earlier than that.
Okay, so what was the early music then?
I started playing like accordion and just fiddling around on instruments in Damascus when I was really, really young.
Okay.
And then we had a close friend of the family who was a violinist that used to come over and play. And my parents love music. They sing, they don't perform. We don't have any musicians in the family, but there were always these gatherings and there was always music around. And so I wanted to learn to play the violin. And then a good friend of my father's, a Syrian film director, his name's Raymond Boutros, was working on an art house film and was looking for a young boy to play a role in the film, a simple role in the film, but the young boy was to play the violin in the film.
Okay.
So my father suggested I do the audition and I got the part. So I ended up actually learning the violin to play the role of this young boy in the film.
That must have been exciting.
Yeah, it was really beautiful. I was 8, I guess, yeah. It was really beautiful, so much fun, like going out. We filmed in Damascus and Homs and Hama. So I remember, being in taxi rides, going to those places, staying there and being on set. And
that must have been an experience
really
as an 8-year-old child.
Yeah.
Oh, that must have been lovely.
Beautiful. It was
yeah.
really beautiful. Yeah. I mean, it's funny because I practiced so hard to be able to perform the violin in the film without it having to be dubbed or anything. But the main scene that I had where I was supposed to be playing the violin, when we got on set and director called action and I started performing, he just stopped everything and started shouting, and this is the wrong song, and what's going on, and why did you learn this, and who taught you this? And turned out that the teacher, it wasn't my friend's, my family's friend, it was another teacher that was teaching me this song for the scene, had taught me the wrong song.
Oh no.
And so I was so disappointed because he was like, okay, we just need to film now and we're just going to dub it later. And so I'd been practicing so hard, trying to get this thing
bless.
really, really perfect. And in the end, it had to be dubbed. So
Oh. But you were in the film.
unfortunately, but I was in the
But
film.
you were
yeah.
in the film. And so you carried on playing violin?
I did, yeah. I carried on playing the violin once we came to the UK. Luckily, at the time, actually, music education in the schools here was really easily available. And because we were a refugee family, I was able to access those classes without my parents having to pay a lot of money. So I continued with the violin and was playing in school orchestras until I was about, I'd say 13, 14. But then I just got really bored of the repertoire and playing the Pirates of Penzance every day, and doing all this Christmas stuff and whatever. And that's when I got into punk and other things. And I just dropped the violin, started playing guitar, bass guitar, and then I got hooked on the drums from the age of about 16.
Wow. So you still do the drums? You still play the drums?
I haven't played for a while, actually, but yeah, I mean, they kind of, playing the drums stayed with me, even in the period when I was studying oud. I studied oud very late.
Okay.
And there was a period when I was very seriously practicing oud and studying, but still drumming at the same time in a couple of prog rock bands. So I would be like, I remember a couple of nights where I would literally do an oud solo performance, finish that, and then run off to play a gig somewhere else with, and it was so extreme at one point, it got a little bit too much. I was like, I can't handle this.
That must have been interesting. I mean, was the drumming the relief side of it? And
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, like going back to the conversation we had earlier, there's a rebellious side that wants to come out, and there's an anger that ends up developing inside you from everything that you're experiencing and the news and the kind of lifestyle that you have to lead and the lifestyle that your family have to lead and the struggles and the hardships they have to go through. And so pounding the drums was just an amazing way to just vent all of that out. Yeah, absolutely.
Amazing. And so you said, so when you went to uni, were you still playing the drums? And so you carried it on through uni life?
Yeah. I was
Okay.
playing right through. Because I went to university quite late.
what did you study?
I studied ethnomusicology, actually, at the School of Oriental and African Studies.
Okay.
Essentially, I knew that I was in love with music, and that's all I wanted to do. And a few years before going to university, I'd kind of dropped. I was working in media before.
Okay.
I used to work as a runner for NBC News
Yep.
when they were based here. Then I worked for a couple of other English international TV stations. And I just got sick of having a full-time day-to-day job whilst at the same time trying to play music and play shows and go to rehearsals and do all this stuff. So at one point I decided to just quit working, do freelance work and play music all the time. And I was just drumming in that period. And then 2003, the invasion of Iraq happened. Everything in my mind just got kind of flipped. And I decided I wanted to try and, re-engage and reconnect with the culture. And I'd already tried to play oud a couple of times, but it didn't quite work out. And then
For the people that don't know what oud is, how would you explain it? It's like
the oud is a lute. It's an instrument that's really popular in the Arab-speaking region everywhere, from Morocco all the way to Iran. And it's the equivalent of the guitar or the piano with regards to the music of the Arab region. So I met a friend of my father's. His name is Ustad Hassan al-Imam, Iraqi oud player who lives here in London. And I heard him play and completely fell in love with his style of playing. So asked him if, he would teach me. And at the time, he was like doing a small course at the School of Oriental and African Studies as part of their music studies program.
Okay.
And that's when I found out about that. And I didn't want to go back to studying, but at the same time, I wanted to make music full time. And I didn't want to study classical music. I didn't want to do jazz. I didn't want to learn how to be a session drummer. I didn't really want to do like pop stuff or anything else. And so this was I found this to be really engaging. So to study ethnomusicology is basically to study the music of the world and to study it from many different angles. So you're thinking about music and gender, music and religion, music and politics, musicology of other kinds of musical cultures. So for me, it was just amazing.
I'm going to ask a cheeky question right at the end. Who's got the best music? But I know that's not an easy answer.
No, there is no answer apart from everybody has the best music. Yeah.
And so Oud, so your relationship with Oud started after 2003.
On a deep level, yeah.
On a deep level.
Yeah.
Do you want to tell us a little about that?
Yeah, I mean it's multifaceted, to be very honest with you. There's many layers. One layer is that it's such a prominent instrument in the music of the Arab-speaking region that it's very attractive in that sense. The Iraqi style of playing the oud is, especially, I would say, like the school that's very much influenced by Jamil Bashir, Salman Shukur, Munir Bashir. That school, that way of thinking about the instrument is equally like popular and spiritual. And so having access to that kind of meditative, very internal ability to express oneself through improvisation based on a kind of musical structure was really powerful for me in that period of my life. And there are also many other beautiful things about the oud with regards to its role in the culture as the instrument of composers, the instrument of theorists, the instrument of solo performers, singer-songwriters. It has such a central role to play in the culture, both in the popular sense and in the more intellectual sense. So this for me was it was just something really magic, that, especially because I had access to a teacher that was really well versed in all of that, specifically the Iraqi tradition, the Iraqi maqam tradition, the philosophy of the instrument. His ability to improvise was always just phenomenal. So learning to express oneself on something so simple as wood and strings was, after having spent so many years playing loud rock music that relied on carrying lots of stuff around and needing to have electricity, and so finally having an instrument that I could just go back to this very one-on-one relationship with was really, really powerful.
Amazing. And so did you perform while you were playing? Were you performing for people? What was the feedback like? How did you feel while you were performing? Because it's like you said, it's more you and the oud. It's not about any other instrument, not about anything else that's related to music. It's just the solo. You and oud. You're not even singing, right? You're just playing.
Yeah.
Because you did say earlier that you were doing oud and then you would go to punk rock and play the drums.
Yeah.
So you were doing those solos, weren't you?
I was doing those at the same time. So I didn't perform for a very long time because my teacher was kind of against it. Ustad Hassan was like, you have grown up in a different environment. You need to kind of recalibrate and retune your ears and your capabilities. You need to get re-engaged with this culture. So take your time. Don't just, spend these couple of years learning and then feel like you can or should be out there performing. So it took me a really long time. I released my solo album 7 years after I started studying, and that was 7 years of intense oud study, including doing the BA and the Masters at the School of Oriental African Studies. So I didn't do that much performance in that period, but once I started performing, it was just a completely new life for me.
Elevated
100%.
the whole.
Everything changed. Yeah, everything changed. Especially when I started I started making connections with friends in the Arab speaking countries. After the release of my solo album, I started getting invited to play shows there.
Wow.
And this for me was magical. Like being able to go to Cairo, Alexandria, Beirut, Amman, Ramallah, Tunis, and perform after being so disconnected, but after having spent these 7 years like really invested and working really hard and practicing really hard and studying really hard and reconnecting with the language, and was just a magical experience. Really magical.
I bet.
Yeah.
And so that changed your whole perspective of music? Would you say oud change your perspective or something else?
Yeah, 100%.
Oud.
100%. Yeah, I mean, I had a tendency to have an interest in the metaphysical and the spiritual and the intellectual, theoretical side of things before I started playing. But the oud represents so many things, and it has so many layers to it that once I dived in and just kind of let myself adrift in its ocean, really everything changed. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And the oud style that you were playing was Iraqi style?
Yeah. I mean, I studied, my master's was, the official title was Performance as Research. So my master's thesis was actually a performance and a small write-up based on the Iraqi oud school.
Wow.
And what is the Iraqi oud school, and how did it come to be? And historically, the Iraqi oud school is really a mix of the Egyptian style, the kind of Shami, Bilad al-Sham style of playing, and the Egyptian style of playing, the Turkish style of playing, a strong influence of Anglo-European art music, like classical music, but then also Iraqi maqam and Iraqi rural musical styles, al-atwar al-ghinaiya, these kinds of things. So I traveled to Egypt to study Egyptian oud for a while. I went to Istanbul to study Turkish oud. And I was doing all my studies with Ustad Ahsan here at the same time. So I was playing Iraqi style, but at the same time I was diving deep into the other styles that what's the word? That are crucial to its kind of character in some way.
And what would you say it's different? How would you say it's different, the Iraqi style of playing to the other Arab world?
So the main thing that's different is that the Iraqi musical landscape is very rich and very varied. So you have the Iraqi maqam tradition, which is a kind of musical genre in and of itself, and very complex with well-defined guidelines and kind of musicological rules and regulations that you have to follow, with very specific melodies, with very specific ornaments, very specific intonation. So that's a certain kind of repertoire. Then you have all of the rural music from Iraq, which is so different because the country itself is so rich and has such a wide variety of different ethnicities and different kinds of cultures. So there's the music and the singing from the southern part of Iraq is very different to that's from the north. It's very different to that's from the west. It's very different to the main cities. So all of those things end up combining in the Iraqi style of playing. With regards to the oud itself, because the performance of the oud as a solo instrument was not a thing before the Iraqi conservatoire was founded in the early 1930s.
Okay.
Before that, the oud was always an accompanying instrument. It was either oud and vocals, or oud within the takht ensemble, which is the small Arabic music ensemble. Oud, qanun, nai, kamanja, riq, just a very, very small ensemble. And so the graduates of the conservatoire, who all studied under a Turkish teacher, his name was Sharif Muhyiddin Haidar, they all started to develop this solo style of performance based on his teachings and his research. And that's what gave the Iraqi school a difference. Aside from the kind of musical content, there was also this idea that all of a sudden the oud is actually capable of sustaining itself, sustaining a musical performance for an hour without singing, you know, based purely on all of this rich musical heritage. So
I've listened to Shamma,
Nasir Shamma, yes, of course.
and the way he plays and the way he's absorbed in his oud, it's absolutely mind-blowing, I think. Sometimes when I just observe him playing, I get lost in his world. And I wonder, do you feel the same way?
100%.
Yeah.
Yeah, I studied with him in Cairo at the
Did
Arab
you?
Oud House. I love his early recordings. He also released an album quite late, late in his like cycles of albums, called Ard al-Sawad, the Land of Darkness. And it was an album that is based 100% on Iraqi material. For me, is one of my favorites. He also told me that he recorded it in one session at a studio one day. He went to visit a friend that had a new studio, was just playing, recording, testing the studio out, the different microphones, and just got lost, you know, and recorded this album in one shot. And it's incredibly stunning to listen, especially when you know the Iraqi repertoire that he's referencing. I mean, he became a huge name in the Arab-speaking region very, very quickly, not only because of his technicality, but also because of the depth of his playing. But many people were unable to notice those Iraqi references. So for me, having researched that and studied that with Ustad Ihsan and on my own, being able to recognize those small little ornaments and those little melodies that he's developing, bringing in things from the Iraqi maqam, things from popular songs, it's really, really powerful. So he's always been a massive inspiration.
Yeah, he is. He really is, and all his work is amazing. And I can't fault anything, especially if you love oud and if you love just the solo music. He's brought something special. He really did to the Arab world in general. So
yeah, his I remember him saying many times in TV interviews and to us even when we were studying with him that his aim was to bring oud into every house in the region. And this is, you know, it's not an easy feat, especially when you have such a rejection actually of that culture and much more engagement with instruments like the guitar or the piano. It's a big feat what he managed to accomplish, you know.
well done to both of you.
Thank you.
So later on in life, so you've now finished your PhD. Where did you go next?
Where did I go next? Well, I got a little lost actually after finishing the PhD because it was quite intense, and I ended up, you know, working down many avenues. But one of the things that became really central to my practice and to my research was the relationship between music making and technology, and what that means for us musicians who are invested in musical cultures that are not Anglo-European, and how do the technologies affect the way that we engage with our music. Yeah, so right now I just started a postdoctoral research fellowship at the American University of Beirut, where I'm helping start a music technology lab with Dr. Joseph Bakarji, who's a data scientist. So I'm actually in the mechanical engineering faculty, which is something very, very different for me.
Oh, yeah.
And extremely, what's the word? It's nerve-wracking, to say the least.
Really?
Yeah, because all of a sudden now I'm in the sciences. I'm no longer in the arts and humanities. And I'm very comfortable in the arts and humanities. But put me in the sciences and then, you know, it's a completely different ball game. But it's nice because I bring this, you know, very focused and quite, you know, a deep love of music of the region and research into its history and manuscripts and music theory and these many things. And they have specifically Dr. Joseph Bakarji, but also the other faculty and the students, they have a very different, you know, relationship with music. They're very much engaged in engineering, coding, AI, machine learning, data sciences, the physics, all of this, you know, far more complex.
Can AI mix with Arabic music?
Absolutely. There's no reason why it can't. I think one of the preconceptions or the misconceptions that we have about music technology is that it would struggle somehow to represent or allow for the representation of other musical cultures other than Anglo-European cultures. And it's really a misconception, because the technological tools at their core can do anything you tell them to do.
Okay.
And they're more than capable of the complexity of our musical culture. But because of the oversimplification and the amount of approximations that are utilized in Anglo-European music theory, which is the bedrock of the majority of sonic technologies, music technologies, it's become very difficult for us as non-Anglo-European musicians to engage with our own musical cultures based on its own terms, on its own logics. But that doesn't mean that the technology itself can't do it. So this is the challenge that I'm having now in this postdoctoral research fellowship, which is we want to create tools that allow us to explore and express and experiment with our musical culture, but we don't have the data sets. We don't have easy access to musicological theory that allows us to build upon it. So we're basically having to create these foundations from scratch in order for us to be able to reach many of the simple ideas that we have of the kind of goals that we've set ourselves. But the beauty of it is that there's a lot of low-hanging fruit. We'll do all this hard work now for the first couple of years in order to lay these foundations. But once those are solid and well planted, then I think we're going to be able to run very, very, very fast.
Wow.
Do you think AI will be creating old music then?
It's already doing it.
Oh, okay.
Well, it's already doing it. Spotify are already doing it.
But doesn't that take away from the musicians and their talent?
Of course it does. But again, this is another misconception about technology, but specifically with AI. I mean, there's all these fears, that AI is going to take over and, take away our jobs and remove creativity, etc. But the reality is that's going to happen, right, in many circumstances. But the reality is that it's just another tool. When drum machines were developed in the 70s and 80s, percussionists and drummers were going crazy that we're all going to be out of jobs. We're not going to, we're drumming and percussion, which is such an integral part of humanity, right? Absolutely, since the beginning of time, all of a sudden has become reduced to this electrical box. And that's just not what happened. It's just not what happened. And expression changed. And the way of engaging with creating rhythms changed, but that didn't stop drumming. It didn't put drummers out of jobs. It changed the way that they had to engage with music making. And I think really, this whole wave of AI now is something that allows us to be more creative if we approach it in an ethical and a critical way.
Okay.
Those are two really, really important points. We need to be very, very aware of the politics and the environmental and the socio-cultural and the economic, frameworks that surround it and its development. And we need to be ethical in the way that we engage with training data sets, training models, building data sets, and figuring out how to leverage these tools in order to represent our work. If we can do that, then I think we're going to have so much depth that we can access. And not just in terms of, I'm going to type, whatever, like a text to music. I'm going to create a text to music application and say, I want an oud taqsim in maqam rast, and all of a sudden it's going to happen.
Okay.
That's going to happen, but it's going to be the most surface level, uninteresting thing that can happen. What's going to be more interesting is to be able to go in and say, I'm a music composer. I want to experiment with developing maqam rust in and doing these strange modulations and find a different way to engage with this musical culture and think about it with an eye to the future and with openness rather than trying to recreate something from the past. You see what I mean?
So like a tool, really.
100%. It's
Tool
a tool.
that goes, like it works like for the musician.
It's an instrument.
Okay.
At the end of the day.
Yeah.
And whatever that means, whether you're thinking about music theory, whether you're thinking about music production, whether you're thinking about analysis, all of these different things all play into it.
And so can I ask you about your music? Have you taken your music to Iraq?
I haven't performed in Iraq yet,
Have
no.
you not?
Well, I only went the first time in my life last March. Aged 43.
And how was that?
So it was amazing. Of course, super intense, very, very emotional, very impactful, really powerful.
Did you get to see much of your family?
I did, yeah. I met uncles and aunts and cousins and managed to travel a little bit in the country. But I couldn't bring myself to travel with the oud the first time. I don't know. I didn't want to arrive and feel like I was going there to represent myself in some shape or form. I wanted to arrive and be able to absorb and listen and engage with people rather than performing or presenting. It would have been beautiful, to have this kind of welcome home, and be able to share that. But I just didn't feel like I wanted to do that in the first instance.
How was the trip?
Yeah, just incredible,
I'm going to dig a little bit deeper. What part was incredible?
Well, I was just about to say that I grew up, like I mentioned earlier, really living Iraq vicariously through my family, through my parents, and through their friends. So the generation that were born in the 50s, basically, and
the good old days, as they say.
Yeah, and aside from the culture and the politics, we grow up with place names, road names, descriptions and details about cultural things, whether it be eating mazgoof on Abu Nu'as or I don't know, traveling to the Ahwar or walking around the old city, being engaged in the cultural practices of the time, the incredible visual arts that were happening, the poetry, the music, all of those things. And so to finally be in that place, and it was such a strange experience because I've never been there, but I've seen the images, both the good and the bad, and I've read and I've heard, and to finally be able to just jump in a cab and go Sahat al-Firdaus was just like, wow, to just be able to jump in a minibus and go to Nasriya was really like powerful. Finally, you have access. Not only is your language surrounding you, your dialect is surrounding you. All these cultural details are all around you all the time, completely normalized. I remember just like that. It sounds really stupid, but being in the street and hearing tiny, small children, 3, 4, 5 years old, speaking in an Iraqi dialect for me was so incredibly heartwarming. Because that's just not been my environment. I hear Lebanese kids, I hear Syrian kids, I hear Egyptian kids, I've heard Palestinian kids, I've heard Tunisian kids. I haven't been able to be surrounded by Iraqi kids, and just being able to feel that, was really, really moving, really powerful.
Did you feel you're finally home?
Yes and no.
Hmm.
I want to just say yes, 100%, but I can't. It would be disingenuous of me to say that.
What's the no?
The no is I didn't grow up in those streets, unfortunately. So absolutely, I was home in the sense that finally I was able to relax. I was able to be the me that grew up. You know, the me that grew up at home in Damascus or in London was finally able to be present on the streets. This was really powerful.
Absolutely, yeah.
And and it changed so many things inside me. I felt like it's not so much about feeling home, it's more about feeling like your center has become stable.
Wow.
I felt like in the past, my axis was always just, like
A bit of a wobble.
just wobbling, and it is disquiet all the time. And then suddenly I got to Baghdad, and it just kind of just solidified. And now I was like, okay, now I know where my axis is. Now I know where my point of reference is. Now I've experienced it. I've tasted it. I've smelt it. I've walked it. Even though it was a short trip, and but it broke the barrier of emotional and psychological fear of actually what am I going to feel like when I get there. This question of home is, I think, a huge thing, not only for us, but all the generations that came before us that had to leave, especially because of the darkness that everybody suffered, both in Iraq and outside. So to feel that sense of stability was really powerful. Now I know 100% Baghdad is my reference. It's my center. No matter where I am in the world, that's it. That's become solid. But yeah,
I was going to ask, did your accent become better, and then do you speak more Baghdadi once you saw, it's like, wow, everyone's speaking it? Or did you, because traditionally Iraqis are known to change their dialect wherever we go. You know, if we're in Lebanon, we put a Lebanese twist on it.
Absolutely.
We're in Syria, put a Syrian twist on it, and it's just Egypt. We switch Egyptian. But you know, when you're in Iraq and you're like, okay, everyone's speaking my natural tone, and it's just like, okay, now wherever I go, and I think we had this discussion in an early conversation between us, where I was like, I want to speak more Iraqi.
absolutely. Like this goes back to this idea of
The stability,
centeredness
yeah.
and stability. Finally, I was able to go out in the streets anywhere else and assume myself, like to be more true to myself, without feeling like without being bothered by being misunderstood. But there are many other layers as to why I think we've always had to be adaptable, whether it be the kind of discrimination and an internal Arab racism, whether it be the sense of
I think we're very hospitable as well, so we try to fit in with the people around
absolutely,
us as
that's another part of it. We want to make people feel comfortable
Yeah.
around us, whether
That's
that
true.
be by being welcoming to them, or by taking on I wouldn't say a persona, but a different kind of role within a space, in order to reduce the boundaries and allow for that communication and for that interaction. So I learned to speak Egyptian Arabic, Lebanese Arabic, Tunisian Arabic. Obviously, when I was growing up in Syria, I was speaking Syrian Arabic. That, I lost that over time, although the Iraqi remained. But after the Iraq trip, 100%. I went back to Lebanon, or I'm now being back in Lebanon. I'm much more conscious of speaking in Iraqi dialect while I'm there in the streets, but also with all my other friends, with my Palestinian friends, with my Egyptian friends. I want to be me, and I think that's basically been my process for the last, from the age of 9 onwards. It's just been this very, very personal journey of trying to become myself and trying to be the best version of myself that I can. And that Baghdadi centeredness, that Iraq centeredness was the missing piece, you know. And once I managed to have that experience, all of a sudden everything else changes. Yeah.
Do you think, giving credit to your parents, the foundation that they built in you, that being Iraqi, this is your culture, this is who you are, this is your language, that strong foundation, do you think that helped you?
100%, 100%. But I would go beyond that. I would say actually the Iraqi community in London played a huge role for me. The women that I was surrounded by, the mothers I was surrounded by, khalatna, our aunties, and the men that I was surrounded by had a huge impact on me. And one of the key center nodes for that was Al Kufa Gallery that was in Queensway.
Yeah.
And having that cultural space. And as much as I used to hate it as a teenager, but looking back at that period now, for me, I think that was one of the most important things. Having this cultural space where every Wednesday I would go with my father and connect with his friends there, connect with the children of his friends, meet new young people who were my age, of my experiences. We never really used to engage so much with the cultural activities that were going on. You know, it was always the Iraqi poets reading and, you know, some visual arts
I remember
exhibitions.
going there when I was younger. There was an art exhibition, but I can't remember if it was my artwork or my brother's or my sister's. It was just on the exhibition. I was like, oh, and it was just like seeing us as kids artwork on the wall. It was fascinating.
Amazing.
To be there.
Yeah, it's amazing. You feel like you have a space that represents you and that welcomes you, especially in a city like London, which can be very, very violent in many ways. Knowing that every Wednesday I'm going to go to this place and I'm going to be surrounded by these people, and that familiarity and that regularity was I think really, really, really important. And it's really sad that we don't have a space like that anymore. We don't even have. I mean, I know there's the Mosaic Rooms, and there's a couple of other venues that do kind of Arab-focused things, but having somewhere that was specifically Iraqi, but that was also open to many other cultures and very welcoming to all the other Arab and Maghribi cultures and artists and intellectuals, was, I think, really, really, really important. And it's such a shame that that place doesn't exist anymore.
Doesn't exist. Do you think it doesn't exist because the younger generation are more busy in their fitting in their what's the word I was going to use? Sorry. They're busy in their own lives and in their finding themselves in this culture and trying to make something of themselves, that they can't focus on things like bringing the community together, bringing, you know, all these, because from what I remember, the Kufa Gallery brought in so much wealth of experiences together, and we were taught so much from uncle this and aunt this, and everyone had something to share, and everyone was so embedded in their culture, and they wanted to share that. Where now I feel like it's a bit lost with the younger generation, and that's why we don't have something as strong as.
Is it not the fact
Kufa?
that we can go back to Iraq now? We can go and see it, and
Do you
that's why.
think?
I mean, if you think about it, when did it really close down, or when did people stop going to it? When Iraq opens its borders, and people were like, I can, on those holidays, rather than going to a gallery or doing, want to feel Iraq, you just jump on a plane and go. And I think that's sort of one of the few things that when the borders were open and we were allowed to go, people. I'm not saying they lost their Iraqism in the UK, but they you can just go home and see it. You can go home and do
There
it.
isn't a need for it, maybe. Do you think the younger generation feel there's no need for it? Whereas the older generation, they wanted to keep us informed of our culture and our heritage. And that's why they had these places like Kufa Gallery and other places.
I would argue it's a little bit more nuanced than that. I think.
Okay.
I think that at the time, so the early days of the Kufa Gallery were very much dominated by a pan-Arab representation, and it wasn't so much just it was an Iraqi-founded and an Iraqi-centric
True.
space, but it was also very, very connected to the plight of the Palestinians in the 80s. It was very much connected to the Syrians that were, dissidents against the regime of Hafiz al-Assad. And it was a period of time in the UK where those kinds of spaces were actually able to exist. I'm not sure how many people know, but the Kufa Gallery was founded by Mohammed Makiya, who's a very famous Iraqi architect. And actually, he used to own the building.
Okay.
So I think I would argue that the socio-economic environment the socio-economic and political environment in the UK today, and actually in the last 10, 15 years, does not allow for that kind of space to exist. The Iraqi Community Association that's been here also since that time is struggling, year after year, it's struggling more and more and more to maintain itself, because there isn't any kind of support from the local governments in London or the regional or the national government to maintain those kind of cultural centers. I think after, I don't say after, but in this phase of the genocide of the Palestinians in Gaza by the Zionists, with the backing of the United States and the UK, and general criticisms and more awareness of what Anglo-European white supremacy and whiteness has done over time, I think young people today are much more aware and much more in need of those kinds of spaces. And I think they are creating those moments wherever they can, especially during this period of such intense Palestine solidarity. The connections that I've seen happen over the last year and a half in London were much more transnational, even beyond only Arabic. So, South Asian and Asian connections, Asian Afro-Asian connections, Arab Latin connections, or Asian Latin connections. All of these connections were really heightened in this period. And I think if there was a socio-economic ability for some of those young people to create a space, they would do it. But rents are, out of this world, extortionate. Spaces themselves are non-existent, and it just makes it much more difficult for people to connect. And it's beautiful to see things that happen in a kind of satellite formation or constellations, where different events happen in different spaces and different communities get to connect together. But I think being able to have a physical space that has a lifeline beyond 5 years, 10 years, where you can invest your time with ease, and you can invest your energy with ease without worrying about its shelf life, is something that's really, really important. And that's what made the Kufa Gallery really unique. I'll tell you a quick short story.
Cool.
While I was studying at the School of Oriental African Studies, I spent quite a lot of time studying Hindustani music from the north of India. I was studying tabla with Sanju Sahaji, and just learning a lot about Hindustani music in general. And one day I was in the library just going through the CDs and trying to find music to listen to. And I found an album, I don't know, it was a solo vocal khayal performance by Veena Sahasrabuddhe. And for some reason, I was just attracted to the album, and I thought I'd take it home and have a listen. So I took the album, went home, pressed play, fell in love with the first 3 notes that I heard, and listened to this whole album from start to finish. And while I was listening, opened the booklet to just read what was inside about the music, about the artist. And the first thing I saw was recorded at the Kufa Gallery, 1994.
Wow.
And I was like,
Oh, that's such a
this
shame.
is so absolutely beautiful that all of a sudden I've done this like weird circle. Like I know I missed that show. I didn't see it.
Yeah.
I wish I had been there. But the fact, just knowing that the Kufa Gallery, which was such an important place for me growing up, was actually hosting these kinds of events as well, and was being a space for these kinds of musical performances from apparently a cultural tradition that has nothing to do with us because there's no language connection and etc. Proved to me that the Kufa Gallery was a far more important cultural node in London than what even we thought it was growing up.
Okay, that's such
And
a
I would love to
shame.
see somewhere new like that, you know, pop up.
I think also with social media, you know, people have got a platform to do what they want, where they want, when they want, and it's diluted a lot of the galleries. It's diluted a lot of open
Spaces,
spaces where people have a freedom to talk or meet. And I think that's one of the things, the negatives of social media, if that makes sense, because people feel that this platform will give me, rather than having a couple of 100 people in a place, I have millions of people potentially listen to me with regards to that.
Definitely. I mean, there's a sense of instant gratification and
Yes,
satisfaction that comes with
absolutely.
social media. But I think also with regards to London, a lot of the mainstream spaces ended up taking over a little bit. South Bank Centre, Barbican, National Theatre, these kinds of spaces ended up imposing themselves somehow on the subcultures. And in a way, at least in my view, in my opinion, appropriated them and diluted them in many different ways. But that also became a kind of false sense of satisfaction. And I think that where we're at now, in this phase of heightened awareness of what it actually means to be from somewhere else in a city like London, with the genocide taking place and the amount of repression and oppression that's been happening, I think young people today are far more equipped and able to create new spaces that better represent them and their multiplicities than what was available in the previous years. I mean, for me, growing up in London, the late 90s were like the last period in which I was able to engage with subcultures from other parts of the world because venues and spaces for those kinds of things existed. Early 2000s onwards, they all started closing down. And by the 2010s, all we had were really small venues, capacity of like 50 people, maximum 70, or spaces that were like 1,000 capacity. Everything else in between, that's like 100, 200, 500 capacity, was completely taken out of the cultural sphere in London because of real estate, because of high streets and big chains, etc. So I think we need to always be aware of the socio-economic, political environment that we're in, and what kind of agency do we have?
Yeah,
You know,
absolutely.
I mean, we can make a podcast today, but can we actually open a space?
Yeah.
Uh,
And I don't know. You travel a lot, and then every time you come back to the UK, do you see a change? Because from everything you've said, like while you were saying it, I was just imagining walking through the streets of London, how much they've changed since the 2000s, from what we grew up in the 80s and 90s here, and it's completely changed, hasn't it? Although you would agree with me.
Yeah, 100%.
Yeah.
100%.
So do you see that change every time you come back?
you know what? I would say that I didn't see much change until this year. Like this year was really transformative for London, I think. 2024. This is where one of the first times where I really felt London change in terms of its activities and the kind of spaces and the kind of things that were going on. That's also because I was quite disconnected.
Okay.
For the last 10, 12 years, I was, in and out a lot, but not for long periods of time. What I did see was a real extreme overflow of mainstream capitalist culture. I think that's what really, really changed. Like, you have far less independent businesses around in wherever you go. The high streets and the high street chains have eaten up everything and taken over everywhere. There was so much less of what made London this beautiful cosmopolitan, strange web of multiplicities. That was the change I saw. It was a much more neoliberal capitalist change, and now in the last few years, especially with this year, I think that's starting to take on a different form, a different shape.
Khyam, I can continue talking with you for hours.
Yes.
I mean, the conversation is just phenomenal. What we do have on the podcast, I don't know if you've seen any of our episodes just yet, but what we do is we ask the last person to ask the next person a question. And then we ask you to ask the next person a question.
Okay.
So the last person asked, Naba?
He threw it back, didn't he?
Yeah.
The question that we asked him, he threw it back. What was it?
It was, what do you feel was your unfair advantage?
Oh, you mean growing up in London? My unfair advantage was being Iraqi. Yeah, 100%. It's a different. Yeah, it's a beautiful culture to come from, and there's a different kind of nuance in it. I'm not going to say that it's better than anything else. It's not about that, but I think Iraqi culture has something so special about it because of its history, because of its place geographically. I think it's, as much as it was really, it felt like a burden for many years, and it felt very heavy and painful for many years. Now thinking back, I would say it's an unfair advantage, absolutely.
And so what would you ask our next guest?
Oh, I wasn't prepared to think of an interesting question.
Putting you on the spot now.
Yeah, you are.
No, but while he's thinking of a question, obviously music is a big part of the world. And Iraqi music was silenced for a very long period of time. Where do you think it stands now, in your opinion?
In the Arab world, I think, well, it depends what genre of music as well we're talking about. That's the thing. What genre of music are you referring to? Because if it's a solo music, I think oud has always been a big part in the Arab world. And the Iraqi maqam, like you talked about, I think they love it. And they've always have loved it. If you're talking about the pop, Bob. Yeah, if you're talking about pop culture, then Iraqi music is everywhere. Every country I've visited recently, they're blasting the Iraqi music, and it's very loud, and everybody's dancing to it, and everybody loves it, and people recite the words to you, and you're thinking, how do you know these things? How do you know what they're saying? But everyone seems to be speaking in that music tone. But yeah, so it depends where. But I definitely think Iraqi music has always been on the map in the Arab world anyway. Because like you, I grew up in Syria for the first part of my life. And like Nadam al-Ghazali, for example, like people were singing Nadam al-Ghazali on the streets of Syria. And like I knew Nadam al-Ghazali through my Syrian friends more than my family. And there are other musicians, but I cannot think right now of their names. And that was always being played in Damascus, So for me, wherever I go in the Arab world, they are very familiar with Iraqi music, very familiar with Iraqi songs. And it makes me proud because this is where we are from.
It's beautiful.
It is beautiful.
Absolutely.
Sorry, I just thought I'd give you an opportunity to think.
So my question would be, can you imagine yourself having grown up in a city other than London?
Oh, that's an interesting question.
That's really interesting.
And I say that because I found out from my parents quite late in my life that they had applied for a refugee settlement in Sweden before the UK, and they were refused. And then the UK opened its borders, and we came. And when I heard that from them, I tried to imagine myself having grown up in Stockholm or Gothenburg, speaking
the language,
Swedish, you know, not having access to what I had access to in London.
The community.
The community, all the other kinds of communities as well. And I was just like, I cannot imagine who I would have become.
That's a great question.
That is a brilliant question.
Yeah, no. Again, thank you so much
Thank
for joining
you.
us.
Thank
It's
you
been
so
so
much for having me.
insightful and
Beautiful to be here.
thank you.
I'm
Thank you so
looking
much.
forward to hearing what you're doing, what's with the university, and how AI is going to be growing with Arabic music. So that's going to be an interesting
Definitely.
thing. Please keep us up to date.
Inshallah. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.